might have to click something to give permission for it to be recorded. These talks will be available on the College Church website and on my Vertical 101 website in the future. And Tim, I don't know, he might have something to do with them as well at UMass. So they will be available. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Timothy Randier, who will introduce the evening for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So I just want to start off with mentioning some statistics to give a context for Brian's talk, and then I will introduce him. We are losing almost 1 million people every year because of water, sanitation, and waterborne diseases. We are losing like probably 1 to 5 species per year, which has substantially increased 1,000 to 10,000 times faster recently. 12 million hectares of farmland is being lost because of exploitation. We use almost the natural resource. Our use rates are almost to the extent that we need 1.5 Earths to cover our needs. So we are using more than what is available. 4.3 pounds per day per person accounts to US alone 220 millions of solid waste per year. Tree loss, the deforestation loss is roughly, we are losing the area of Panama. It's also, for the context, it's 2.5 Massachusetts every year of tree cover lost. Almost 63% of the global fish stocks are exploited. So just as a context for what is happening, and so one thing this, I work in hydrology at UMass, and I often see that there is a critical need of the stewardship which God has ordained us. And I'm so fortunate to have Brian Webb. Brian is a director of the Center for Sustainability and an instructor in environmental studies in the Hoofton College. He teaches environmental stewardship at an institutional level and also practices it. One accomplishment in Brian's leadership is the college has achieved 32% carbon footprint reduction, which is a great achievement. He has 2 master's degree in experiential education in Minnesota State University and sustainability and environmental management from Harvard Extension School. Brian is also a founder of a Christian ministry called Climate Caretakers. He also co-directs the Christian Climate Observers Program. A very active leader in broader creation care movement in the US. He enjoys outdoors, and he has avid hiker, camping and birding, and loves to travel with his family. And I think he wants to mention that he has the goal of climbing to the highest peak in all 50 US states. So it's an awesome one, and we are so lucky to have Brian remind us of our stewardship commitment to this creation. Brian?
Well, thanks so much, Tim and Chris, for that generous introduction. I am really excited to be here with you guys this evening and looking forward to our talk tonight. And for those of you who are able to join us tomorrow as well, I am going to share my screen here so you can follow along. Tonight we're going to focus on talking about what is a biblical view of the ecological crisis that we're facing. Tim gave some statistics to start us off with that are quite sobering related to the condition that the world is in right now. And yet, when we look at what's going on with the environment, we also sort of see that often there's kind of this tension area between faith and science in a number of different areas, but environmental areas, environmentalism is certainly one of those areas where we frequently see this tension in society on that, where on one side, you have many people of faith who are skeptical of scientific claims. And on the other side, you have people from a science background who are skeptical people of faith, who they perceive to be not engaged with solving some of the big challenges that the world is facing. And so often we kind of seem to come to this impasse where a significant portion of the populace here in the United States has a difficult time engaging with some of the most important issues that the world is facing today. So that's kind of where we're going to start. And tonight, particularly looking at what is the Christian case for why we should care for the environment. But I'm going to start off with and ask you guys a question, and feel free to use the chat, or you can unmute yourself and pipe in here. But it's a word association here. So what word comes to mind when you hear the term Christian environmentalism? What do you first think of?
It doesn't exist.
Sorry, say that again. David says too often missing in the discussion. Sure, great.
I was going to say missing in action.
There you go. Good. MIA. Someone else, word association. What's the first thing that pops in your head? Christian environmentalism. What do you think? You're like, it's Friday night. I've got nothing in my head. What we should be doing but aren't. That's good. I like that, Megan. Thank you. All right, let's keep moving along here. So just a quick outline of what we're going to cover this evening. First, I'm going to give just a really quick, short overview of the current ecological crisis that the world is facing. And then we're going to entertain the question that some scholars have posed: is Christianity to blame for the state that the world is in today? I'm going to look at the evidence around that, talk about that question a little bit, and then spend a lot of time looking at a variety of Christian perspectives on environmental stewardship, particularly from a theological view, but also from a historical, ecumenical, and a global view, to try to get a more full picture. The narrative in our culture tends to kind of point one direction. We tend to kind of hear how Christians are not engaged in the environment. Your comments on my first question certainly reflect that narrative, which we hear a lot in the media, we perhaps see around us. So we're going to try to go beyond that perspective and get a bigger picture of what is here, and then end with a few concluding thoughts there. So let's take a look at, first of all, what's going on in the world. Well, first off, you may notice there's a lot of people in the world. If you look at the rate of population growth over time, you will see that it has grown quite exponentially in recent years. In fact, if you were to take numbers and context and labels off of this graph and hand it to a biologist and say, here's what's going on with the population of a certain species, what do you think is going to happen next? Almost any biologist is going to tell you, well, that species population is going to crash because no species can sustain itself with an exponential growth curve like this over time. Now, the prospects are much better for us than that, in part because we are clever enough to be able to devise ways around to expand the capacity to accommodate our species. And in part because our population is beginning to level off. And I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow morning. So it's not quite as dire as it may seem. Nevertheless, there are still quite a lot of people in the world. And correspondingly, we take up a lot more space and we have a lot more needs of the environment around us. And so wildlife populations are in significant decline. The World Wildlife Federation puts out a report every few years called the Living Planet Index. Really fascinating report with a lot of great data in there. And they found that over the past 50 years, we've seen a 68% decline in wildlife population levels. When I went to update this chart, actually, just a few months ago for another presentation I did, I updated it from the 2018 report. And in the 2018 report, it was only 60% decline. So it went from 60 to 68% decline in just 2 years. So quite significant drops that we see. Most of this decline is due to habitat loss and overexploitation, habitat loss particularly because, well, we've got a lot more people around who need a lot more space to live and a lot more resources to accommodate our lifestyles. which means we're encroaching more and more on animal habitats, which means there's a lot less room for them in the world. As you would expect with dropping wildlife numbers, and as Tim referenced earlier, species are going extinct at incredibly fast levels. Some scientists say they're going extinct at 1,000 times the natural background rate. Species go extinct from time to time, that's always happened, but today they're going extinct about 1,000 times faster than they should be, largely because of that role of human influence. That's led some people to say that we're currently in the middle of something called the 6th great extinction, that we're experiencing a mass extinction event today, but unlike the asteroids of old, the one causing this extinction event is simply human activities and human encroachment, particularly on habitats of species around us. Deforestation is on the rise to very disturbing levels. We've lost more than half of the world's tropical rainforest since the 1960s. In 2019, we lost the equivalent of 30 football fields, that is soccer fields. Backwards. 30 soccer fields of tropical rainforest every minute. So significant losses in biodiversity. About half the world's biodiversity is located in tropical rainforests. So the losses there are even more significant than elsewhere. There's a big pile of plastic in the oceans as well. I don't know if you've heard of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's gotten a lot of media attention lately. It is more than twice the size of the state of Texas, which makes it 58 times the size of Massachusetts. And it's filled with quite a lot of plastic in it. A lot of that plastic being microplastics, which are very small particles, which are highly detrimental to animal life in the ocean and cause a lot of serious problems and take many, many hundreds to thousands of years to break down under natural processes. It's not surprising that we're here, since the world is using 1 million disposable plastic water bottles per minute. So it's not surprising that at that rate, we would accumulate quite a lot of plastic that tends to end up in the oceans. And the world is getting a lot hotter as we go. They just declared 2021 to be the 6th warmest year on record. In fact, the 10 hottest years on record are all within your lifetimes. In fact, they are all within my 12-year-old daughter's lifetime, the 10 hottest years on record. So it's a very disturbing trend that we're beginning to see here. And we haven't even gotten to a whole host of other problems as well, such as the way that invasive species are rampaging through our forest and causing major tree die-offs, or water pollution that Tim referenced, and all of the problems that comes along with, or ocean acidification. A whole host of other environmental challenges that are out there. So in short, we have done a lot of things to kind of mess up where we're at. Now, some scholars have put out this idea that Christianity is to blame for this. That starts with a man named Lynn White Jr., who in 1967 published an article in the prestigious Science magazine, where he put out this idea and basically referred to Christianity as the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. In other words, no other religion is more centered around humans and human well-being than Christianity. And that as a result of that, that is what has caused and led to many of the crises that we're facing today. Now, at first glance, that might seem to be unfair, but if you really think about it, he does seem to have some pretty good points there, in the sense of looking at some of the ways that Christian doctrine has been put out there and influenced our society's thoughts in a number of different ways. For example, we tend to, within Christianity, see things from the perspective of the world exists to serve humans, that is primarily for us. Even if we're adopting a stewardship perspective, we often use the phrase of, we need to protect the world that God has given us. So even there's this sense that it's for us, and then we need to protect it. And there's some theological foundation behind that. But if the world exists for us, and particularly if it only exists for us, then that leads to some very clear directions that are perhaps not particularly helpful for good stewardship. A linear perspective of time that many Christians hold to, this idea that God created the world plays out, and then that God will burn up the world at the end before Christians go off to heaven. That kind of eschatology leads to a very definitive sort of use it or lose it kind of mentality. That has not been helpful either. The separateness of God and humanity from nature, and the imago Dei, that humans are made in God's image, this important theological concept that we are like God and our role here, all of that kind of points to this, making it more difficult in some ways for Christians to engage with the stewardship mindset. And Lynn White is saying that these are the reasons why we've gotten to the spot with where we're at today. And we're going to continue to have this until we realize that nature has more reasons than just serving human purposes, is where he's saying. Now, if you take a look at that and explore it from this idea of Christian anthropocentrism, his argument has some merit from the first chapter of Genesis as well. Again, talk about this idea of imago Dei, that God created humans in his own image. But then we have this verse in Genesis 1:28, where God tells humans to fill the earth and subdue it and to rule over the things in the earth. And a lot has been made of what exactly does that mean? Other translations use the term dominion over. What does dominion mean here? And an anthropocentric kind of perspective often interprets that to this exists for us as humans, and we should use it as we want to use it. So for example, Answers in Genesis, which is a fundamental Christian group that is kind of an anti-evolution group, and their question and answer page, when their question pops up, how should we think about global warming? The answer they put there is our primary focus should always be on people, as in we don't worry about that global warming, climate change kind of thing because we're focused on people. Of course, that's a false dichotomy, which we'll talk about more explicitly tomorrow morning as we dig into the details of that. But the point being that they're saying our focus is on people. We don't worry about the world. We focus only about people. It's a very anthropocentric type of attitude and is unfortunately all too common within a lot of our culture today. And particularly if it's a juxtaposition of the two, of either an egocentric or an ecocentric perspective, where one puts humans on an equal level with mushrooms and starfish, whereas the other one has humans up sort of at the top of a pyramid of importance. Many Christians sort of look at this and say, well, if I have to pick between these two, I'm going to go with the egocentric perspective. Unfortunately, too often it ends up here as well, where the man is above the woman. Again, many of the more fundamentalist traditions will sort of have that as well. And that's a whole nother rabbit trail. We don't need to go down here today, but ends up being problematic in a lot of different perspectives. And I'm going to pose an alternative at the end here tonight for these kind of two mentalities that perhaps is more useful for us in the end. So again, if we got this anthropocentric attitude where humans are at the top of God's creation, combined with this we're made in God's image, important piece of Christian theology, and the reality of the fall, which has caused sin to enter the world, then it seems almost inevitable that an ecological crisis would come about from that. And that's kind of the argument that Lynn White is making here. We see this echoed in a number of other ways as well. Rich Cizik, who used to be the vice president of the National Association of Evangelicals, began to bring up climate change as an important topic that the NAE should address and talk about. And there was an immediate and strong backlash from James Dobson and a whole host of other evangelical leaders that tried to oust him because of this, saying that he was taking away emphasis from the great moral issues of our time. Of course, they were referring primarily to sexual ethics in that reference, because too often within the stream of Christianity that ignores environmental problems and other social challenges that exist in society today, everything gets boiled down to just one or two issues that seem to dominate, and all of the others tend to get pushed aside. Or if you look at statistics around beliefs on climate change, you see that Christians, we have here white evangelicals, white mainline, white Catholic, are among the lowest demographic, with white evangelicals being by far the lowest demographic in terms of percentage who agree that climate change is caused by humans. Particularly compare that to the green box here. Unaffiliated, this would be people who don't register a religious background. Christians are much, much lower than religiously unaffiliated people in terms of believing that climate change is human caused. Or even on attending worship services. People who attend more worship services are less likely to believe in climate change. So very problematic perspectives here related to Christian responses to environmental problems. And then we have all these other sort of anti-environmental groups out there. This is one ludicrous video series called Resisting the Green Dragon that has all kinds of inaccurate scientific information and essentially is a piece of ideology attempting to convince Christians that you can't be a Christian and care about the environment. So Lynn White's thesis seems to have some merit if you simply look at the level of what's going on in society today and what does the dominant media narrative around Christianity in the United States seem to say. Now, I want to dig a little bit more into that because I think there's a whole lot more going on than the Lynn White thesis seems to point to. And I think we can find a lot more richness and interest in the Christian tradition around environmental stewardship if we simply look for it. So start off with, so we're going to look at a number of different biblical passages here. And I recognize this is a little bit proof texting here, which can always be problematic. But I think that the text and the concepts that we have here are pretty emblematic in general of the overall arc narrative of Scripture. So I think this is pretty consistent with what the biblical narrative seems to present and is hopefully accurate for that. So first of all, everything belongs to God. Pretty easy biblical concept to go along with. It's located many different places throughout the Bible, and also it tends to not at all be controversial from that perspective. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. To the Lord belongs everything. These are biblical narratives that are highly agreed upon, pretty easy to simply come up with. So everything in the world belongs to God. We also see that God's creation is intrinsically good. If you remember back to, if you're familiar with the Genesis 1 narrative, there are 6 days of creation. And after each day of creation, God reflects back on that day of creation and declares what he just made as good. So creates light, it's good. Creates water, it's good. Creates the land, it's good. Creates animals, they're good. This all happens before humans ever come on the scene. Humans come on the scene in the afternoon of the 6th day, metaphorical, literal afternoon, whatever you want to take there. They're in 6B. 6A is when God creates all the land animals. And then he creates humans after that. And before all that happens, everything else has already been declared good. So the goodness of creation, the goodness of the natural order is already established before humans ever enter the scene. And then at the end, God looks back on all that he has made, everything that's made, and declares it good. So there's an intrinsic goodness there. Also see that God loves and cares for the natural world. We see this echoed in many different places as well. He has compassion on all he has made. Look at this passage from the Gospel of Matthew here. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Probably heard this before. Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. Not one sparrow, Jesus is saying, not a single sparrow dies without God caring about what happens to that. That's a remarkable theological statement, if you think about that, with significant implications. And then here's one of my favorites in Genesis 9. We think of this, often you hear this referred to as God's covenant with Noah. This is not God's covenant with Noah, because 6 times in Genesis 9, God specifically says, my covenant is with you and with your descendants and with every living creature on the planet. God specifically covenants with every creature on the planet. Every single time he mentions the covenant with Noah, he mentions every creature on the planet. Again, really remarkable here to see the level of care and concern that God has for all of the created order. The natural order points to and glorifies God. See this in a number of different places, particularly in the Psalms. We see this quite prevalent throughout the Psalms in many different places, as well as this great passage in Romans that points to God's divine qualities being understood through the things that he has made. A theological concept we think of as general revelation, as opposed to specific revelation being what is put in the biblical text, general revelation being what we can learn about God through the things that he has made. God's ultimate plan is to redeem all of nature. We see this a lot in Paul's writings, particularly. In Colossians 1, God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, not just all people, not just humans, but all things to be reconciled. And then in Romans 8, the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. That there's a liberation, there's a redemption here. That God, we know God is in the redemption business, but not just for humans. He is in the redemption business for all of creation. There's a redemption plan for all of creation, as is echoed in Paul's writings. Humans have been given stewardship, dominion. We've been put in the garden to work it and to care for it. Those words are abad and shamar, literally means to tend and to keep. And dominion, when I talk about dominion, what I like to liken it to, because this is often where people sort of go astray on, is dominion has to do with leadership, right? So dominion is responsibility, it is leadership, it's being in charge. What, from the biblical narrative, what does God's model of leadership look like? It's servanthood, it's service, it's humility, it's putting others before yourself. This is what is consistently echoed throughout Scripture to be good leadership. It's these things. So if we are given dominion over the earth, then probably a more correct interpretation of that is we are to serve the earth. We are to put the earth's needs above our own. We are to be humble in how we responsibly steward what God has given us responsibility for. So that would be a more accurate interpretation of that kind of concept if you're looking at the overall arc narrative of what Scripture says about dominion and leadership in general. And then lastly, God's not pleased with bad stewardship. Think of the parable of the talents, where he holds people responsible for what they've been given. Or I'm always reluctant to bring up Revelations passages because they're just so confusing and difficult to figure out what exactly they mean. But this one seems a bit sobering. Destroying those who destroy the earth. I'm going to be a little bit cautious and make sure that I'm hopefully not among that number. But we see a pretty consistent theme here and a trajectory that seems to point in a particular direction. We also see that creation has standing in the Mosaic Law. We see actually a lot of interesting passages related to God specifically providing protections for the natural world in the Mosaic Law, such as the Sabbath concept. God specifically ordains a Sabbath year for the land. Every 7 years, the land is supposed to observe a Sabbath, with the land rests. The Sabbath day of rest is also for animals, not just for humans, for domesticated animals. God tells people not to pollute the land. There's another passage where God tells the Israelites, if they besiege a city, do not cut down all the trees surrounding that city. So there's a lot of protections for the natural world in the Mosaic Law. I already talked about this a little bit, but God's model of leadership is one of service and sacrifice. Again, we see this consistently throughout the biblical text. And oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry, did somebody have a question? No, okay. And this concept of loving your neighbor. When Jesus was asked, what is the most important piece of the law? He responded with love God. And then the second piece is to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, sometimes people will use that as an argument to say, we don't need to bother with the environment because we have to focus on people. But what they're missing there is the connection between humans and the environment. God did not put us into this world in some sort of void. He put us into a particular location as part of an overall bigger system that operates on this planet. And that when we don't take care of that natural system around us, that comes back on us, and humans suffer from that. There are millions of people around the world, as Tim referenced right at the beginning here, that are suffering from environmental degradation that could be prevented. That's not loving your neighbor. If we are the cause of environmental degradation that causes harm to others, and we are, then that's not loving your neighbor. So that's an important concept here too. Probably the most frequent argument that I will hear against creation care, environmental stewardship, action on climate change is the argument for the sovereignty of God. So there's, of course, this important biblical concept that God is sovereign, meaning that God has ultimate power and all things are under his control. And it is an important theological concept that we hold to be true in the Christian faith. But it does ignore a few important realities. First of all, that we live in a fallen world where bad things do happen. Fires burn down houses. People get sick, sometimes even after we pray for them to be healed. Coal plants do cause cancer and cause children to be born with birth defects. This happens. Pollution causes people to die. All of this is reality. So if you're going to say the sovereignty of God would never allow the planet to warm, on an overall basis, well, what about all these other arguments about the ways that humans have impacted the natural environment, and yet we see them with our very own eyes, that those impacts are there. Actions have consequences. The other piece of that is the role of free will. God regularly allows humans to make decisions and to face the consequences of those decisions. And sometimes those decisions result in negative consequences, whether we meant them to or not. And I think all of us can probably think of examples in our lives where we had a negative outcome, even if we didn't intend to make a mistake. Nevertheless, consequences happen because of that. So sovereignty of God does not need to be an excuse for not caring for the earth. I don't want to dig too much into eschatology. And I think I'm running a little bit behind time on here, except to say some of these passages that seem to point towards an ending of the earth or a burning of the earth. There's a lot more theological depth to those shall we say ambiguity to those than might appear at first, according to some interpretations of them. For example, this the earth and everything in it will be laid bare. That Greek word literally means found, will be found. So sometimes it's used to mean destroyed, but the literal word means found. And there are other interpretations of that as well. Or that humans will be caught up in the air when Jesus returned. That caught up in the air is the same word that's used to welcome, means to go out of the city to welcome a ruler back into the city. It's more of meeting someone and then bringing them back to your house. Same thing for a new heaven and a new earth. That the term means new in quality, not a new item. It's more meaning renewed, as in there's the other biblical analogy like of a refiner's fire that we see in the Bible. This idea that God uses fire to refine and to make something clean, to purify something. That's probably more consistent way of looking at that rather than a destroying completely. Eschatology is messy and confusing, and probably best not to formulate your entire worldview based upon one particular strain of eschatology, rather to look at the overall arc of Scripture and the directions that points. So a few theological conclusions, and then we'll look at more other perspectives within the Christian tradition. One, natural world that is apart from humans has intrinsic and tremendous value to God. Humans, of course, also have intrinsic and tremendous value to God, but it's clear that the rest of the natural order also has that as well. The humans do have a special and unique position vis-a-vis the natural world. God has given us a special and unique position, but that position is one more of service and stewardship and love. It should be our responsibility, at least according to the way that the biblical narrative reads out regarding our role in the cosmos. And that redemption and restoration of all things is part of God's ultimate plan. Coming back to this here, this comes from Dave Bookless, who is the CEO of Arasha International. And he points out that we saw this ego and eco before. He suggests a theocentric perspective where humans do have a privileged and unique position, forming the foundation of a heart of love towards the rest of God's creation. So rather than being above and dominant over, it's this idea that we form this foundation of love and service for the rest of the created order that God has made, realizing that it's made by God and belongs to God is probably a more healthy perspective. Okay, let's look at a few historical perspectives here to go back to, because one could easily ask this question: isn't this environmentalism a brand new thing that Christians just brought up in the last couple of decades and never used to care about? Well, that's not really actually the case. You can going back to St. Augustine in the early church. He had some pretty strong words to say against an anti-science perspective in the church, warning people, look, even non-Christians know something about the earth, So he calls it disgraceful and dangerous to talk nonsense about these topics. So watch out for an anti-science perspective, because you're pushing people away from the faith, is what he says. Which is one thing I often like to bring up today. Like, look, we don't have to have our head in the sands on these issues, because when we do, we're pushing people away from Christianity. We're making it less attractive for them. This is not a new idea, apparently. St. Augustine thought of that a very long time ago as well. Of course, St. Francis of Assisi, we're probably all familiar with, the patron saint of ecology, the namesake for the current Roman Catholic Pope. It was famous for preaching the gospel to the birds, they say, because he cared for all of God's creatures. And had a very expansive version of the gospel that included preaching the gospel to God's creation. Now, we can argue the merits of whether that's a valuable use of time or not, but the point being, an important church leader who is highly respected and valued felt that treating God's creation with such respect and deep adoration deserved his time, and was particularly important. Martin Luther, even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree. Why does he say that? I want to think it's because that is following in God's footsteps. God created apple trees. God is inherently creative. The process of producing life, of tending and encouraging life, is a very God-like process. So planting an apple tree is following in God's footsteps and doing what God likes to do, that is create and protect life. God writes the gospel not in the Bible alone, but on trees and flowers and clouds and stars. Great concepts, great ideas here. Houghton College comes out of the Wesleyan tradition. We are a Wesleyan institution. And so our foundation goes back to John Wesley, who incidentally was a vegetarian for animal rights reasons. Very important theologian, very significant in terms of expanding Christianity in the UK and the US. And he was a vegetarian because he was concerned for God's creatures. Now, I'm not saying you have to be a vegetarian in order to be a Christian. That's not what I'm saying. But an important church father thought that was the case. And so followed along with that as well. So I think much has been made of kind of the scientific disagreements and antagonism that perhaps is out there. People think of Galileo and how he was mistreated by the church. But then again, that antagonism, when we think of an example like Galileo, who's the bad guy in that story? We all agree that the church was the bad guy in that story. So perhaps today we could think maybe that antagonism that was not helpful then is also not helpful today. In terms of a more ecumenical perspective today, when we look outside the Protestant tradition, we see lots of support for environmental stewardship. Pope Francis has been an ardent champion for creation care in many ways. His encyclical Laudato Si, which is an absolutely beautiful piece of writing, by the way. If you have not read this, it's not terribly long, and it is fantastic. He unites social and economic justice concerns with environmental concerns and shows how those two are integrally linked in society today. It's a strong critique of greed and consumerism and failed stewardship. It's a lament for the problems that we've made and a strong call to action to change our ways. It's really a great piece. So here's the head of 1 billion Catholics in the world who is making strong statements that our treatment of the natural world is going in the wrong direction and that we need to repent and to change that. It's the same thing from the Orthodox Church as well. Patriarch Bartholomew, who is the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, of the various branches within the Eastern Orthodox Church, has been referred to as the Green Patriarch. He actually made a statement: when will we understand that a crime against nature is a crime against ourselves and a sin against God? Can you imagine a Protestant pastor standing in the pulpit and saying a crime against nature is a sin against God? They would get voted out, right? This is so contrary to what our culture thinks of, but this is the head of one of the biggest branches of Christianity, a highly respected, devout man of faith who is making this important statement. We see both of these individuals, Patriarch Bartholomew, Pope Francis, joining with Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the head of the Anglican Church, joined to make a joint statement in advance of COP26, the UN climate conference that just took place in November in Glasgow. And they wrote a very powerful joint statement asking world leaders to take a strong stance responding to climate change. Listen to the cry of the earth. It says, we stand before a harsh justice. We greedily consumed more of the earth's resources than the planet can endure. It called for an immediate and urgent matter of survival, and that we must choose life differently. So incredible statement from three of the most significant branches of Christianity. Within Protestantism, in many mainline churches, we see very strong stances on climate change and other environmental issues that are the norm for many different denominations as well. And on a global perspective within the evangelical church, we see quite a lot being said and done as well. Despite what we might see in the USA, on a global scale, global evangelicals are deeply concerned about environmental issues. Climate Intercessors is a group of evangelicals from all over the world who gather via Zoom to pray for the climate on a regular basis. Climate Vigil was a candlelit prayer vigil held all around the world at the same time during the COP26 climate conference. This is a group of the Christian Climate Observers Program. It's a group that I co-founded with a friend of mine to send Christian leaders from around the world to the climate conferences to obtain observer badges with the UN so they can be part of the proceedings there. And many different people from around the world have joined in with that. This man right here is Ephraim Tendero. He is the former general superintendent of the World Evangelical Alliance, the alliance that oversees all evangelical denominations in the world. He was actually a delegate for the Philippines at the COP21 climate conference when the Paris Agreement was signed. So he was there representing his country to sign that, and at the same time was the head of the evangelical church there as well. This incidentally is Catherine Hayhoe, world famous climate scientist, and Dave Bookless, the head of Arasha, some other influential figures in evangelical Christianity. Here's one of my favorite ones. So you may or may not have heard of the Lauzon Movement. So the Lauzon Movement started by Billy Graham and John Stott. It's where we get the terms 1040 window and unreached peoples groups. You can kind of think of this as the United Nations of the global missions movement, world evangelization. So they've had 3 global congresses over the past 50 years where they come together to basically scope out what does the world evangelization effort should look like in the future. The most recent one in Cape Town in 2010, among many other things, it's not specifically focused on the environment, but one of the statements that came out of that was the statement that probably the most serious and urgent challenge faced by the physical world is the threat of climate change. And world poverty and climate change need to be addressed together and with equal urgency. This is the world's missionaries, thousands of missionaries gathering to talk about evangelization. And one of the statements they put out is climate change is equally as important as poverty in the world today. If only every American evangelical could hear and understand that statement, it would completely change. I mean, it probably wouldn't, because I know the reasons why we're stuck in our opinions, but this is significant. This is really significant to realize that the world evangelical movement sees climate change as profoundly urgent to respond to. Also coming out of that, something called the Jamaica Call to Action, which just built on that Cape Town statement in order to add to it, sort of fleshing it out in a more robust way, saying creation care is indeed a gospel issue within the Lordship of Christ, and we're faced with a crisis that is pressing, urgent, and must be resolved in our generation. And then they had 10 specific principles coming out of that to shape what should creation care look like from a global Christian perspective. And you can just kind of glance and read all that, but very interesting to look at that as well. And it's not like evangelicals in the United States are a monolith of anti-environmentalism. There are a lot of great organizations and great work being done within evangelical Christianity in the United States around this as well. Here's just a few examples. Young Evangelicals for Climate Action does a whole lot to engage young people on this. The Evangelical Environmental Network, which frequently will equate creation care with being a pro-life issue. That's sort of the mantra they're known for. Creation care is a pro-life issue, equating those things together. Arasha does great conservation work. Plant with Purpose, if you're not familiar with them, fantastic organization that planted over 50 million trees around the world, mostly in impoverished countries. and they connect their tree planting work to work of building the church on the global scale too. So some great work that's being done around the world on this as well. Almost done here, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So a few conclusions to think about. First, there are some really strong reasons, historically, biblically, theologically, for Christians to support a pro-environmental perspective. Hopefully, we have demonstrated that pretty well here, but from a biblical and theological, from historical and ecumenical perspective, there's a lot of reasons to really support this kind of approach. At the same time, there seems to be a pretty obvious disconnect, particularly between American evangelicalism, and really I should more specify American white evangelicalism, and much of the rest of the Christian faith on environmental issues. The simple reality is that the rest of the Christian world outside of American evangelicalism does not have this kind of environment versus faith perspective. Australia's a little bit alongside, pretty similar to us in some of the cultural challenges there. A little bit in Canada, a little bit in the UK, but the vast majority of the Christian world, including the Christian evangelical world, environmental issues are of high importance for them. And then really the culprit here, so it's a variety of complex factors, but mostly political polarization and sociocultural worldviews that make this challenging in our particular context. The whole reason why we have to have a seminar about why Christians should care for the environment is because this polarization and these worldviews have kind of wrapped it up in such a way that it's become difficult for us to engage with them in a helpful dialogue. That's what we're going to dig into a lot more tomorrow, and exploring, among many other things, but exploring some of that factor. And then I'm going to close with this quote, which I feel like describes well. A famous quote from Gandhi: "I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." And I think in this particular context, that is especially helpful, that the problem is not Christianity. Lynn White is wrong. Christianity is not the problem. The problem is that many Christians have not accurately lived out their faith around environmental stewardship issues, continuing to today. And that is what has made it so complicated and so difficult for us to engage with this. So that's where I'm going to wrap it up. I've got, if I can just do one announcement plug before we move into the Q&A time. I want to plug the class that I'm teaching, and Chris joined this class last year, so you can ask him if it's worth joining in. I teach a free online course. Well, if you want credit, you got to pay to get college credit for it, but you can do it for free in webinar format, called God, Country, and Climate Change. It's 8 weeks long, starts March 9th. There's the link there for how you can sign up. The course revolves around bringing in high-profile guest speakers to deliver the content. So really, some of these people are some of the top experts in the world in their content. Catherine Hayhoe, one of the top climate scientists in the world. John Cook. There's probably no one in the world who understands climate denial better than John Cook does. He's really fantastic. Bob Inglis is a former member of Congress, Republican, and talk about what climate action looks like on a political level. Bill McKibben, you probably recognize that name. And so there's a lot of really significant, we have people come speaking from Kenya and the Philippines and Australia. It's an exciting course. If you really want to learn more about a Christian perspective on climate change, I think this is a great opportunity to do so. And I don't say that just because I want you to take my course, but I really think it's a great educational tool. And our goal is just to get it out there so more people can hear. So feel free to take a look at that. Okay, I'm going to stop now. And where are we at? Oh, okay. Pushing it a little bit on time, but we got time for some questions, and I'll hang around as long as you guys have questions for.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not going to end the feed or by any means. We can chat for as long as people want to chat and ask questions.
I've got a question. Brian, thanks for sharing that. As you talked about how the American evangelical Christians aren't as attuned or don't prioritize, creation. I mean, I think in my circles, I see it a lot. So, I know a lot of Christians, including some on this, that it's an important thing for them. But I guess my question is that more a reflection, not of American Christianity, but being in the American culture? Like, wouldn't the countries around the world, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Europe, they're much more concerned about the environment than Americans are. And so the Christians in America are in that culture. And so, and I'd also say, I don't know if like Russian evangelicals are as concerned about the environment, or Chinese evangelicals, because maybe they're fighting for their lives, kind of thing. So I don't know, thoughts there. Is it just a reflection that Americans in general don't care about the environment as much?
Yeah, that's a great question. It has everything to do with American politics, is what it does. And we'll dig into that a little bit more tomorrow. But the American, particularly American evangelical culture has become so wed to conservative politics. And that has disrupted the ability of many American evangelicals to separate out an issue that is perceived to be a left issue. It makes it difficult for them to engage with that in a way that is helpful and constructive, because it's seen to be a left issue, and that is oppositional to what the majority, certainly not all, but what the majority of American evangelicals perceive to be the political direction that they ascribe to. And that's also wrapped up into sociocultural identities. It's really difficult to, when all of your peers hold to a certain set of values and beliefs, it's very difficult for you to break away from that to adopt a different set of values and beliefs as well. So that's kind of like wrapped up into it at the same time. As far as, Australia is a little bit the same. They're less polarized than we are on this, but they have some similar dysfunctionality in their politics. Russia, I don't know. There's not many evangelicals in Russia. I know some of them personally because I've been there and done some work there. But Russia is a little bit more disconnected on this than some places. In China, actually, environmentalism is the number one reason why people protest in China, because their environmental conditions are so bad that the main reason why we see a lot of protests in China is for cleaner air and stuff like that. So I would be shocked if Chinese Christians weren't really interested in this. Good question.
Do you know where New Zealand Christians stand?
The two New Zealand Christians that are friends of mine are very passionate environmentalists. And I know that country in general tends to be very progressive on environmental issues. So I'd be pretty surprised if New Zealand Christians weren't really on board with stewardship. But like African Christians, for example, my goodness, they are desperate for countries like the United States to take climate change seriously, to take environmental stewardship seriously, or Christians in Southeast Asia, places that are more on the front lines of environmental impacts, really want the rest of the world to take this seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, don't you think that's a factor, that in America, we haven't felt the brunt of the environmental crisis as much as other places around the globe?
Yep. And part of that's because we're shielded by our affluence, because we have so much wealth that we can cushion ourselves really well. Part of that is the luck of the draw, that our geography doesn't have as much of the impacts as others. But we get, the wildfires that we've seen, the hurricanes that we've seen, those are devastating. But because we have insurance, because we have wealth, we're able to rebound it. If you can think of, like, put in context the wildfires that we've seen in Colorado and California here lately, put those in the context of a less developed country, and that's exponentially worse. And they're bad enough here, but there would be a lot worse there.
The comment, not a question. You said something a few minutes ago that gave me just a ray or inkling of hope.
Good.
I'm thinking about the problem of why American evangelical churches are in such a hole with regard to thinking about environmental issues, and refer to our peers. And if you think that your peers as an evangelical are the mega church down the street, well, that's maybe a problem, but maybe a source of hope is if we start thinking of our peers as the global evangelical church, maybe we could do something, change some minds.
I think that's a great insight, Tom. And we certainly see that in a number of other issues as well, right? The more diverse our friendships are, the more our perspective on other issues changes as well. We become much more accepting and accommodating of people with differences when we actually get to know them. So it's the same thing when we actually get to know Christians or encounter Christians who have a very different experience related to the environmental crises we're facing. And that really, I think, makes it more real for a lot of people. And what we're seeing a lot now too, because the younger generation gets it. The polarization around environmental issues is not nearly the same for Gen Z as it is for the generations represented by most of us here on this call. So you talk to like my college students here, even we're a fairly conservative college. Even the conservative students at my conservative college, many of them are concerned about climate change because they see it happening and their generation is going to face it. So those students are starting to change their parents and they're starting to change their neighbors and their older friends. So that's trickling up. So there's a source for hope as well, along with it, kind of what you're saying, Tom. Unfortunately, we don't have time for it just to naturally trickle up over a long period of years. But we've got to make it happen a little bit faster than that. But there is hope in the sense that change is happening, and particularly as we're broadening our circles of people that we're interacting with and finding ways to expand that.
So Brian, quick question. I know on the science side, there's a lot of evidences and documentation and quantification of a lot of this we see. Is it also because of the mistrust and also non-belief in the science outcomes causing many of this?
Yeah, I think that plays a role. You know, there's a lot of mistrust of science, particularly within the more fundamentalist circles of Christianity. A lot of that goes back to the creation evolution debate, where, you know, if the perspective is that evolution is completely wrong, that God created the world, and I can't trust scientists on that, it doesn't take much of a step then to say, well, climate change is really inconvenient and my peers don't believe in it, and scientists are saying it's real, so I don't believe in that either. It doesn't take that much more effort to do that. So I do think that that plays a role in it as well. I think it's more so from the political connection, but I do think that there's correlation connected to that kind of anti-science. And really what they've seen is that it's not an ignorance of the science. And it's not as much a mistrust of the scientists, but unfortunately what some of the research has shown is that it's a mistrust of the motives of the scientists themselves, that conservative Christians mistrust scientists to be acting in a ethical way and reporting correct detail. So that's a really unfortunate, and maybe going back to Tom's comment from earlier too, maybe that's the more we can help Christians encounter scientists, you know, genuine scientists who are doing the work, perhaps that can be a helpful way to bridge that gap too. If you're familiar with Catherine Hayhoe's work at all, frequently you'll see from her work and from her stories that kind of a thing where like, oh, she's an evangelical Christian and her husband's a pastor and she's a climate scientist and she's talking about this like it's real. And I think that connection can go a long way in bridging that gap for someone as well.
I think too, there's an issue that we particularly in the church, we don't talk about science the right way. And, you know, I'm as guilty of this as a lot of people. It's easy to sort of knock on scientists, and you can find where there's been agendas and there's been a fudging of the data, right? But, you know, and I've realized that the way I've taught things at times, I've come across as sounding like I'm putting science down completely, but I'm not, you know, and that we need to help people understand that there's such a thing as peer review and, you know, and the scientific method which sort of takes the personal fudging out of it. And I think there's a responsibility for Christian leaders in the church to talk about science in a good way. I'm sorry, I think I cut somebody off there. Susan, were you going to ask a question?
I was just going to make a comment, but I don't want to stifle a conversation about science. So, because mine was not about science. So if anybody wanted to say something more.
No, please go ahead, Susan.
So this is going back, I'm going to put a couple of points together here. This going back to the fellow who felt that Christianity was responsible from 1967. So my freshman year in college was 1975. Am I right? Yeah, 1975. And I still remember, I mean, there's a whole lot I've forgotten about college, but I still remember this moment. I went to Arizona State, which has a huge school of sustainability, but was on this big mall. There were all the, there was a guy speaking on standing up on a wall somewhere speaking. And one of the first things I heard him, he was talking about, it was the zero population growth time. There was a lot of stuff. There were a lot of things, and I can't remember names right now, but I mean, it was huge discussion. And he stood up on this wall and he was saying, and Christians don't care because they just think Jesus is going to come back and save them. And it doesn't matter what happens to the world. So I missed a lot of it, but that I still remember that. It made such an impression on me as an 18-year-old because I was a Christian and I hadn't been in an environment where people were yelling at Christians. And
Right.
It was quite significant. And I've thought about that phrase over and over and over again in my life regarding my view of my relationship to the world and stewardship of the planet and things like that. Because I didn't want to leave God out of the equation, but I was just thinking about all those interesting points you made about where we have this conflict in this. And one of them, I was thinking about that, this idea, like you were saying about Pope Francis, seeing if we really do see this as a stewardship, a relationship issue with other people and the people around the globe that we're affecting, and less about, this is where we might diverge from a lot of environmentalists in that we're not seeing it as we are going to save the earth, which was a phrase for a very long time, save the planet, save the earth. That's not our objective. That's up to God, what happens to the earth. So I realized that if I kind of set that aside and look at it, but that what really happens, I may not be able to save all these populations, and God can restore them anytime. He created them, he can restore them. That's not a discussion or an argument I need to get into. But it should still motivate me to be concerned about what I'm doing to the earth right now and the impact on other people and on the creation that God loves. But what happens with the earth is his. Anyway,
Yeah.
I had to put all that together before.
That's great, Susan. Thank you. I hate the phrase "save the earth" because the earth is going to be just fine. There's going to be a lot of species that are lost, and that's unfortunate. And as a Christian, that does bother me because God created them and called them good, and so I want to do what I can to protect them. Also, because animals are awesome, and who doesn't love animals? But the earth is going to be okay. The problem is that we're really harming people in a significant way. So, like I come back to, I have a friend who is a pastor in Tuvalu. He is a pastor of a church in Tuvalu. Tuvalu is a very low-lying island nation that's being lost to sea level rise. And I just keep thinking of Tafue and his experience in his homeland, as many people are beginning to migrate away from Tuvalu because so often it's underwater. The homes are underwater. And I think of him and his experience, and that the cause of that is my lifestyle and my actions and my country's actions. And that, just as a Christian, I'm not okay with. And so, yeah, for me, it's not about saving the earth. There is an argument for that, a Christian argument for that even, but it's really more about loving my neighbor is really the main motivation for me as a Christian.
And I don't want you guys to think I don't love the earth and don't want to protect. Yeah, yeah, because that's there too.
Other questions or comments?
Incidentally, Susan, at the same time, shortly after Lynn White's thesis, 1970, I think, Francis Schaeffer put out a book called Pollution and the Death of Man. Francis Schaeffer, one of the most important theologians of the 20th century, really significant theologian. And if you've never read it, it's a very short book. It's a great read. I would definitely recommend it. But it's interesting because it's right around the same time as Lynn White's thesis as well. But basically makes an argument for creation care long before that was popular.
Yeah, I think White's thesis is in the appendix of Pollution and the Death.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
It's been a while since I read it. I didn't remember.
Yeah, he's very deliberately responding to White's critique.
Yep.
I could probably borrow that from you, Chris, right?
Pollution and the Death of Man.
Yes, you can.
She's seen your book, so.
Other questions
Brian,
or comments?
You want to give us just a taste of what you're going to do tomorrow?
Yeah, I'd love to. So tomorrow we're going to focus more specifically on the topic of climate change, in part because it is the most significant environmental issue that we're facing, and one that there is great opportunity, I think, for Christians to make a significant impact, and that's important that we understand. So our first session, we're going to talk about the climate science and impacts. So understanding how global warming works, like what's the scientific mechanism we're talking about? How is it happening? How do we know humans are causing it? We're not going to dig like really geeky into the science on it, but enough to like understand how it's happening, I think, because I think most people like, yeah, I get it. The Earth's warming, burning fossil fuels causes it, but don't really understand exactly what that means. And then talk about the impacts. How is that impacting the world? Particularly, how is that impacting humans around the world? And then in the the second session in the morning, we're going to look at solutions. We're going to start by talking about some complicating factors that make it difficult to deal with environmental issues. And then we're going to focus on climate solutions on a number of different levels. So one level, we'll talk about technical solutions. What is it that we need to do? What do we need to change? And is society prepared to do that? And then we're going to talk about political solutions, both on the global and national level, and then end with individual solutions. What does this mean for me in my life? And how can I align my lifestyles and actions with the way that helps address this problem? So that's kind of the quick overview of what tomorrow looks like.
Any other questions or comments before we wrap it up tonight? Well, I want to thank you all for coming. I will put a plug in too for Brian's course that you can audit for free. I just loved it, and the lineup of speakers, just to hear Catherine Hayhoe is worth the price of admission, which is free. And also, Catherine Hayhoe has a great YouTube site called Global Weirding, where she goes into a lot of the details with fun cartoons and everything. It's just great, of climate change. So thank you all for coming tonight, and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. The first session's at 9:30, and then the second session is at 11. And as you can hear, those two really nest together. So if at all possible, take them both in. You can just watch the snow falling and listen to Brian tomorrow. All right. Thank you very much, Brian. Everybody have a good night. Stay safe and warm, and we'll see you in the morning.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.